I, Stephen Joseph Harper, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear that I will truly and faithfully, to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Prime Minister, so help me God.
That was the scene 20 years ago when Stephen Harper was sworn in as Canada's 22nd Prime Minister, serving in that role until 2015. The anniversary was marked by events all week here in Ottawa, including a fireside chat with Harper and former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien.
We're political opponents, but we're not enemies, not today, anyway. And because he's afraid of the Shongan.
And the unveiling of Harper's official portrait on Parliament Hill. Harper was also celebrated at a big gala in Ottawa with tributes from former world leaders and a speech from the former Prime Minister himself. And yesterday, Harper launched his official archival collection at Library and Archives, a collection that includes 400,000 digital records and more than 1 million photos. But throughout the week, Harper delivered some strong words of advice for Canadians at this time in the country's history.
We must reduce our dependence on the U.S. in order to protect our sovereignty and our economy. In these perilous times, both parties, whatever their other differences, come together against external forces that threaten our independence and against domestic policies that threaten our unity.
Here to reflect on Stephen Harper's legacy and lessons for politicians today is someone who worked with Stephen Harper, that's former Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay, someone who worked for Stephen Harper, that's former advisor Amanda Galbraith, and someone who covered Stephen Harper on Parliament Hill, that's journalist Rob Russo. It's good to see you all. Peter MacKay, this week it's really brought the limelight back on the former Prime Minister and his legacy. You worked with him for many years. Reflecting back on that, what do you think of Stephen Harper's place in history right now?
Well, I think it's pretty solid, and I think it'll be enduring. One reflection, just having spent some time around former Prime Minister Harper this week, is that he's not comfortable in the spotlight. It's something he never sought out, and something he's never reveled in. But I would say the reminder that was hanging in the air everywhere was his focus on competence, on being steadfast, more substance, less style. And making politics boring is something a lot of people, I think, are yearning for these days, David. I also, heard him and others talk about his record, and I think it stands up pretty well when we look at issues around affordability, issues of the turmoil in terms of our relationships, some of which, to be fair, we have not brought upon ourselves. But Prime Minister Harper presided over a pretty, I say humbly, a pretty competent administration that was very much focused, dialed in on getting results. And again, I think many Canadians looking back feel gratitude and satisfaction with the job that he did as the Prime Minister of Canada.
So, Amanda, I mean, you were there. First of all, you called this week, I think, Harper-palooza, which I've heard a few people refer to. But you were there from leadership race to opposition and then into government. When you look back at things 20 years after that breakthrough election, what are the standout moments for you?
We saw, some of them kind of played out on the big screen at the big gala event. What stood out to me there was it was a room full of, I think it was 1,200 people gathered from across the country. Former staff, former cabinet ministers, former world leaders came to celebrate the Prime Minister's legacy. And watching these, they called it the Stephen Harper Eras Tour as well. Want to be named after Taylor Swift, but it was, here's the pre-election, going through the minority stages, some of the real challenges we face, as Peter mentioned, around tough economic circumstances, and that was also touched on by the Prime Minister at the portrait unveiling, and then towards a strong, stable, conservative majority government, which they quoted, and the whole room erupted into cheers. But I will say, watching him, the early days opposition leader is always tough around the expectations, around kind of cutting in, around being seen as a leader or a prime minister in waiting, but I think watching him sort of grow in that role, mature in that role, and then take the role of sort of an elder statesman in Canada, praising the prime minister for forging forward, and I think really uncertain times for us is a huge threat from the U.S. Bringing people together around the world, and even just as a staffer, the appreciation for all of us, what we learned from him, and I think Peter touched on this around quiet competency, getting things done, a little less flash, a little more activism. And you look at the people around that room that I was in, and it is the current leaders of, Fortune 500, like big companies in this
Right.
country, big political parties, cabinet ministers. Like there is a huge legacy there just around the leadership of this country that people don't really talk about.
Well, Rob, it's interesting when you look at that breakthrough win 20 years ago. Stephen Harper in 2006, Brian Mulroney in 1988, and those have been like those are that period of time between Conservative victories and nothing since Stephen Harper. I mean, what stood out for you when you look back at the decade he was in power when you were covering him?
Well, I think thanks to the work of Mr. Harper and Peter as well, he actually restored Canada to a functioning democracy that was no longer the friendly dictatorship. To a certain extent, Mr. Harper was responsible for creating the friendly dictatorship by dividing the Conservative vote. He did stitch it together with the help of Mr. McCain.
Oh, you mean by the dominance of the Liberals because of the vote splitting? Okay,
That's right.
I gotcha.
I mean, we really were a one-party state.
Yeah, the math worked in their favor dramatically.
Absolutely. I think people forget the fragility of that first mandate. It was the most enfeebled minority in Canadian history. There were 124 seats versus 103. And so Mr. Harper, I think, always assumed that he had the big bullseye, that it was just a matter of time before the Liberals tried to bring him down. So that fragility, people forget about that. And I think that may have dictated some of his behavior. A different guy, actually, on platforms this week. But I remember him as being rigorously intelligent, even before he went into government, combative to a certain extent, intense. And that was the kind of posture he adopted throughout his government. But when I think about that, I think about restoring Canada to a functioning two-party democracy. I also think of two provincial premiers, Prentice and Kenny. I think of Mark Carney, who wouldn't have catapulted into the higher orbit that he's in now if it weren't for Stephen Harper. I think of, given his, there were no Cupid dolls exchanged between the press gallery and Stephen Harper. It was a very contentious relationship. And yet, I look at his press office. Stephen Lecce was a junior press person in that office. He's now a provincial cabinet minister. Melissa Lantsman is a deputy leader of the party. Corey Teneycke is now the campaign guru and genius who took a third-place city councillor and made him Premier of Ontario, and is trying to do the same thing in British Columbia. So just out of the press office alone, a huge legacy.
Though Teneycke is maybe a little out of favor with the current Conservative leadership, but that things do change over time. Peter MacKay, was interesting. First of all, it was kind of comforting to see the Liberal Prime Minister of the day fet the Conservative Prime Minister of the past and have it be a typically normal, peaceful, democratic moment when you look at what's happening nearby. But Prime Minister Carney talked about Stephen Harper's record on national unity, sort of helping keep Quebec's separatist sentiment at bay, tamping down feelings of Western alienation. As a guy who was in Newfoundland and Labrador watching Danny Williams go to war with Stephen Harper, my experience was a little bit different. But what do you think of the approaches he took on those issues and what the current government could maybe take from that as these things flare up again?
Well, David, it's funny you mentioned the feting from Prime Minister Carney. Don't forget as well that Prime Minister Chrétien was in the room.
Yeah.
Which I think was also, an interesting reflection of two Liberal prime ministers being there for that important unveiling of the portrait. And certainly there were moments of friction during his tenure as prime minister. But, my observations of him this week, both in private conversations and when he was on the stage and speaking, were that, he has a real graciousness, a humility, even a lightness about him that probably, based on what Rob was just saying, it wasn't there. It certainly wasn't on display. We saw his humor behind the scenes and, his sense of pride and purpose in his family, in his country, in the armed forces, in hockey and sport, his love of music. Much more of that humanity came out this week. In terms of his messages, though, to the country, to the assembled, to those who are in the decision-making positions now, he had some very forceful messages directed at the United States, basically endorsing the idea of more diversity, more independence on Canada's front in terms of our economy. He's an economist first. And so he talked about the importance in many of the public pronouncemements about a balanced budget, about restraint within terms of spending, the importance of a pipeline and our natural resources development. The only time he really showed the most emotion, though, was in reference to his family and to the armed forces.
Yeah.
And again, I think watching many of these public appearances this week is really quite a moment for Canadians to reflect upon priorities and the importance of good governance, the importance of having people who are leading the country who are really doing it for all the right reasons. And that is to promote our sovereignty, our economy, the very best that we can get, and the prosperity that we need to exist as a country.
But you know, Amanda, the message of holding the country together, Canadian nationalism, national unity, not a new sentiment from Prime Minister Harper. But he did say this week, pivot urgently away from the U.S., and that's an evolution in his thing. As the U.S. has changed, like he was a pro-American prime minister, and I say that without criticism, and he's acknowledged his advice on how to deal with this has changed over the last 2 years. That was a big thing to hear from Prime Minister Harper, I think, the other night.
Yeah, certainly. And even in the gala celebration, you had videos of past leaders, including George Bush, had a very warm video about his leadership, how the prime minister worked with him. There were notes about how he worked with the Obama administration as well. And historically, that has been the right positioning. But I think, as Prime Minister Carney kind of charts these waters, which are incredibly challenging, Stephen Harper is still kind of the dawn of, he's the most successful conservative leader we have alive today in this country. He is sort of the dean of the party, and for have him speak up and say the path that the current prime minister is charting, that we should, under any circumstances, sacrifice whatever we need to do to protect this country. Those are big words for him. We also have seen him broadly be strongly reluctant, I think, to step into kind of the political fray or international politics. But, from talking to him, I know folks talked to him privately. We all watched him speak throughout the week publicly at these events, is that I think he feels the time is now for him to lean in, to use his political heft to support, I think, what the prime minister is doing, what the country is trying to do. And also, I think, turn the tide for Canadians and conservatives to say, we have to get our heads around where this is going. And I think that was, a smart use of his political capital throughout the week. I would also just say, like, broadly, seeing everyone come together to celebrate him. I don't think we do this enough for any of our leaders, no matter which political stripe. And there should be a bigger convention around portrait unveilings, around anniversaries of governments, celebrating, I think, the peacefulness of the transfer of power between both sides, especially in light of what's happening in the U.S.
Well, look, I talked about that, Rob, on the day it all happened, right? When you see these things in the White House where Joe Biden's been replaced with the portrait of an auto pen, right? And these sarcastic plaques, the comforting ritual of that portrait unveiling in that, all stripes, all parties, the value of public service, the value of serving your country, even if you disagreed on the margins, right?
A couple of things. What's going on now in the United States is a break with tradition. As somebody who spent 7-8 years in Washington, I can tell you one of the wonderful things about U.S. politics was the way members of the most exclusive club in the world, former presidents, would get together, how they would call on each other for counsel, how they would put partisanship aside and help the incumbent, whether he was part of the same party or not. A little aside, however, before we start to get too weepy and sentimental. My understanding is that this portrait was ready in 2023, that Mr. Harper did not want his hanging to be presided over by Justin Trudeau, and he waited until somebody else. I'm sure he was waiting for a conservative to be the prime minister. That wasn't the case.
Well,
so not all grudges are forgotten. But I do think there is something in particular about the relationship between Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Harper that is very evocative of what we used to see in the United States. Mr. Harper admired Mr. Chrétien's discipline. Fiscal discipline in particular.
And Mr. Carney calls on them for advice now, Mr. Harper. Right?
And this is a wonderful thing, and I hope there is some suggestion that Mr. Harper is going to now, having had a turn for a week or two in the spotlight, might retreat. I hope that's not the case. He is just the fourth Prime Minister from Western Canada in our country's history. We are facing a critical moment in our current history now. There is a secessionist challenge in Western Canada. I don't know of anybody who is better equipped to deal with that than Stephen Harper. Not because he is prepared to smother the aspirations of Western Canadians, but to try and advance their interests within the framework of a united.
Well, and he was able to clearly articulate a conservative view on the United States in this moment, which the current leadership is struggling with for various reasons, but that's another conversation. But, you know, Peter MacKay, kind of as a final point, that exclusive club of Mr. Chrétien, Mr. Harper, and Mr. Kearney all dealt with crises that in some way revolved around or emanated from the United States, right? 9/11, the call to join Iraq for Mr. Chrétien, the subprime mortgage and the global financial crisis for Mr. Harper, and Mr. Kearney was in the room for a lot of that as the Bank of Canada governor, and now everything Mark Carney's dealing with now. There's not a lot of people who've held that office and dealt with a crisis like these black swan moments, and the ability to talk to those people and rely on those people and trust those people is important for a country, whatever your partisan leanings.
That's completely right, David. And I mean, to underscore all of that, I think that the theme of put your country first in these quintessential moments of challenges emanated from much of what Stephen Harper said and frankly did, not just this week, but throughout his career. I think he has always very much had this real passion for Canada. Hence his love of the Arctic and hockey and all of that, I think, is really, you know, who he is and the authenticity, I think, that he represents in certain moments came through this week magnificently. And to have, you know, a current and former Liberal Prime Minister present for some of that, I think Canadians took notice. And I hope, frankly, and I say this genuinely, I hope that Pierre Poilievre took notice too. And I think there were some very real and intentional messages coming from Prime Minister Harper about how important it is to really do that, put the country first. And that's certainly where Canadians, I think, are unabashedly. They want their government to put down their partisan swords at times like this.
Friends, we have to leave it there. Peter MacKay, Amanda Galbraith, and Rob Russo, appreciate your time today. Thank you.